All right. Hey, I'm James. Thank you to the organizers. Actually, thank you for inviting me or letting me come and talk. And this has just been a great event so far. I go to quite a few conferences, and this has been the best one so far this year. So let's give a hand up to the organizers and the volunteers here today. So I'm James. If you want to throw virtual tomatoes at me throughout the presentation, you can tweet at me at @Heimbuck on Twitter. Or if you want a copy of the deck after, feel free to tweet me. I'd be happy to send it out. So at Sendgrid, we're using a product manager, me, with our tech ops teams. And first I want to ask if this scenario seems familiar to anybody. A project was started, maybe at Sendgrid, maybe not. And what was thought was that we're going to launch this thing, this container orchestration platform, in a month. Everyone's going to love it, use it, they're going to love us. It's going to be great. What actually happened was it took 6 months to build, and 6 months after it was launched, there's only a few cron jobs on the thing. No one's using it, and no one loves us. Has anybody ever had that experience with the new platform or tool chain that they've launched? Yeah, a couple of hands. Well, today we're going to talk about some tips and tricks that we found successful at Sendgrid that hopefully you can take with you and apply to your own org to ensure that you're building projects that your customers need, that they love, that you're avoiding tech debt, and that you're launching these things faster. And I already gave the slide. So hopefully you'll all take away at least one tool here. I'm going to give you a multitude of tools, and please remember that these are just tools. They're not magic bullets. These are things we found have worked for us at Sendgrid. Your mileage may vary. So who is this guy? Why is he up here and qualified to talk about this thing? Well, as I've said a couple of times already, I'm the product manager for the tech ops or infrastructure teams at Sendgrid Twilio Sendgrid. For the past 14 or 15 years, I've been working with teams of various sizes, teams as small as 2, teams as big as 100, to find, prioritize opportunities, and launch B2B, B2C, and lately, internal-facing products, projects, services, platforms, and really have found a love with those internal-facing DevOps-y type tools. And yep, I use Office Space to explain my job all the time. You'll also find I'm a very visual learner, so get ready for the memes. So let's talk about why would ops ever need a product manager? Well, you have products, your platforms, your services, your tool chain. Those are all products, and they have customers. It's your delivery teams, your other engineers. They rely on those things day in and day out to do their job. And when you introduce a new one, it changes their world, for better or for worse. And so as a product manager, my job is to unpack the problems that those customers are having, really understand what they're trying to do, what they're trying to accomplish, and not just to dream up new fancy things or just hand requirements off to my teams. So there's a buzzword in there. Oh, maybe. Unpack. Product managers love buzzwords. So what do I mean when I say unpack? Well, first things first, I'm going to qualify that problem. And there's a famous quote from Henry Ford that says, if I'd have asked the customer what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. And in part, he's right. But in part, he's wrong. What the customer really wanted was to get from point A to point B faster. Their context was a horse. So of course they wanted a faster horse. The other thing a product manager or product practices can do for you is to quantify those problems. In the Ford example, there were hundreds of people who wanted to get from point A to point B faster. If there had been 2 people, I don't think we would have ever had the Model T. So we want to use that qualification and quantification to understand what are the right things to go solve. We're going to talk about prioritization a little bit more later. So really, the takeaway on this slide, and what I want you to really take away from this talk, is know your customer. Understand the pain that they're having and the problem that they're trying to solve, not just hearing their complaint. So you might be saying, I already know my customer. I talk to my developers all day, every day. Well, these are some of the things that were built by people who knew their customers. The Segway. I mean, really, was it just that last mile transportation, but 20 years too early and just way too expensive? Betamax. I finally figured out why it didn't hit when I was researching this deck. Turns out Betamax tapes were only an hour long. In the home video space, people wanted an hour and a half or 2 hours. They were recording movies and games, baseball games, football games. They weren't recording 1-hour TV segments, which Betamax was perfect for. The Zune, another bit of tech that was actually far advanced for its space. It's just flat out better than an iPod was at the same time. But by the time the Zune came to market, iPod already had a huge share. It was way too big of a hill for them to climb. And finally, New Coke. No one wanted New Coke. I don't know what they were doing. So how can you build platforms, services, tools that are going to avoid the fate of those things? Well, you've probably all seen this diagram before, or some version of the diagram. You're going to build, measure, and learn. And I'm here to tell you that's mostly right. It's just the order is wrong. The order I want you to do these things in is to start with the learning. Then we're going to build, then we're going to measure. And the secret after that is to do it over and over and over. Because the first time, you're probably going to fail a little bit. And then the next time, you're going to fail a little bit less. And you're going to keep getting better at that cycle over and over and over. And any win is a good win. So let's dig in on these learn, build, measure things a little bit. There we go. So the first tool that we're using at Sendgrid to learn is through customer interviews. And when I say customer interview, I don't mean just talking to somebody at lunch. We're using these interviews to learn about workarounds that people have in place. There's a joke in product management that if you see someone outside of accounting who's using Excel to do something, you can go develop a product around that. I'm sure the same thing applies to your tool chain as well. If somebody has workarounds that they're using, you have work to be done. We use our customer interviews not just to find out about the problems, but to talk about what it's going to take to onboard somebody onto a new system. How much work is it going to be to move over to a new tool chain? Because even if a new build system is going to cut your build time by 10%, if it takes 6 months for someone to move over to it, odds are they're never coming on board. And finally, we want to talk about what is the real goal of those interviews. We have two. We want to always learn something new whenever we talk to a team, and we want to validate a hypothesis, either proving or disproving something that we think is a problem for that customer. So some tips and tricks for you when you do go out and talk to your interviews. Like I said, don't count on ad hoc conversation. Schedule time. Actually book 30 minutes on the calendar with your delivery teams. Pull 1 or 2 people in. But make sure that you have dedicated time for these conversations and do them regularly. You always want to be asking open-ended questions. If you ask your developers, does it take too long for builds to run? Do you think they're going to say yes or no? They're going to say yes. If you ask them, how much longer do you think builds are taking today versus a year ago? You're going to start to get some anecdotal answers. And then you can ask follow-up questions of those. Well, what do you think is causing the builds to run slower now? Did you add a bunch of automated tests? Are those running in parallel or in serial? You can start to unpack more problems beyond that initial hypothesis. You want to bring a note taker with you, because if you're anything like me, as you start to take notes, you stop listening. And I miss tons and tons of great stuff. In the absence of someone who can come with you to take notes, please record so that you can go back and listen again and again. And finally, you want to start to cross-check problems between teams. We always find it interesting where one team has a problem, and they're very, very loud about their issue, but they're the only team who's having that problem. Oftentimes, people are just dulled to the pain, but they all have the same pain. And that's the pain that we ultimately want to fix for them. So the second tool that we're going to talk about today that we're finding success with in Sendgrid in the learning process is around a story map. Has anyone here seen or used a story map before? Couple folks? Awesome. Well, let's first, for the folks who didn't raise their hand, answer that question, what is a story map? Well, the best person to talk about a story map is the guy who literally wrote the book on story maps, Jeff Patton. He says the process of story mapping is what keeps us focused on users and their experience, and the result is a better conversation and ultimately a better product. And the key thing to remember here is that the goal of a story map is to get to an outcome, not output. So we want to talk about what is the outcome that we're delivering to our customer, not what is the system that we're delivering as an output. Literally the book. Great book. If you don't have a copy, pick it up. So knowing a little bit about story maps, you also want to know about user stories. So we've already heard this framework today. As a persona, I want to do a thing so that I get some benefit. Well, I want to show you an example of a not-so-great user story and a pretty good user story. This might be a user story that shows up in your backlog. As a developer who waits for builds, I want a new build system so that builds are faster. If somebody gave you that story and assigned it to you, would you know where to start or where to finish? No, because it's not a great user story. If, on the other hand, you got a user story that looked like this, as a Java developer who waits for my builds, I want to have builds that finish in 5 minutes so that I can spend more time writing code. We're talking about the actual benefit that our user is getting out of this. They want to spend time writing code, and they want builds that finish in 5 minutes or less to do that. Now we have a place to start, whether it's realistic or not, and we can start to talk with that customer about how do we get closer to their ideal state. So if you've never seen a story map before, I'm going to run through the classic example of how to build a story map. So our user story here would be, as a tech professional, I want to get ready in the morning so that I can get to work and look professional. So the steps in getting to a story map for that are, first, we're going to start to list all of the things that would go into our ideal morning of getting ready to get out the door. So we're going to do things like get out of bed, take a shower maybe, snooze our alarm, shave, not in order obviously, brush our teeth, floss, take a multivitamin maybe, and a whole bunch of other things. So ideally, if you're doing a story map, you're doing these things as a big group. You're going to spend some time, everyone brainstorming. What are all the things that I do when I get ready in the morning? When you have that big group, you're going to run into duplicates. So you're going to start grouping things together and eliminating those duplicates. We find that a lot of the best steps in a story map come at this part in the process because you start to have conversations about, well, why do you do that in the morning? Why don't you do that in the evening? Why do you do that at this point in the process? Not that. So you're going to start to lump together or group together things that happen around the same time or around the same place. Once you have those things grouped, you want to organize them, put them together in a timeline. So here we have things like we're going to wake up, we're going to have some personal hygiene time, get our clothing situation resolved, feed ourselves maybe, a little personal time, get out the door. You can see we've kind of rearranged things in our groups. Now, if we had a couple of hours in the morning before we needed to get out the door, we could probably actually do all of this stuff, right? But what if it was this morning and you only had an hour? You're here a little bit earlier than you would expect to be. Well, now we've got to start cutting things out. What if it was a morning where that snooze alarm didn't happen because the alarm didn't get set? And now all of a sudden you only have 5, 10, 15 minutes to actually get out the door. So that's where you start moving things down on that necessity line. This is where that becomes ideal, and these are the absolute minimum things that I need to do to still get to my outcome of getting out the door, getting to work, and looking professional. So this is where the magic of the story map happens, is that you draw that line, and above your line is your MVP. Now you know all the things that you need to accomplish for your user so that they can hit their outcome and that you can develop it in a sane amount of time. So story maps are great, but they're not a magic bullet. They're not a great fit for all of your projects. If you're adding on small features to an existing tool set, just use a user story. You don't need a full story map for that. If there are systems outside of your control, like if you are pushing up to an S3 bucket and you can't guarantee it's always there, that's at the end of your story map. You want to stay within your sphere of control and deliver an outcome within that. That's what the story map is good for. And it's not going to ever be a roadmap for you. Those things that are in that first slice are things that you can validate pretty quickly with the team. But what we found is that things in our version 2, version 3, beyond, those are things we think are a good idea. And maybe we don't talk about those outcomes with teams right at the very beginning. We want to make sure that we're starting to validate questions in the early phases, though, so that we know, yeah, V2 is going to be great. V3, nobody actually needs those outcomes. And reminder number 2, it's just a tool. It's not a magic hammer, even if your product person says it is. So I want to get back to prioritization. I'm sure everyone has had this experience of everything being the top priority. And it's probably a product manager telling you that. I'm going to let you on a little secret. You can't have 25 number 1 priorities. It's just not realistic. Sometimes you have to say no. But it's often a lot easier to hear not right now versus no, even if you really mean no. And the best way that we found to do that is to use our roadmap. And we talk about the trade-offs that we would have to make. We talk about the outcomes that we're delivering to our teams in the next sprint or a couple of sprints, and what those trade-offs would be for our teams if we dropped all of that and worked on your emergency fire. So some tools that we use at Sendgrid to get to that roadmap and that list of priorities. Well, it wouldn't be a product management talk if I didn't have a 2x2 square, because they're all the rage. So the first one is a level of effort versus impact matrix. And we use this at the very beginning. If we have a swag and idea about what kind of impact it's going to have for our teams and what kind of rough effort it's going to be in months, we stick it on the grid. And then we start working down from highest impact, lowest effort through. And that's how we start validating that those are real things. As part of that validation, we come up with a RICE score. Now, this is something that Sendgrid uses from Intercom. We use it across the product org, and so we've brought it into the ops world as well. It's reach, which is for us, how many teams are we going to impact? The impact, what is that impact going to be on a scale? And so you might want to use a force rank here of this is going to have more impact than this, A versus B. We have a confidence lever, and this is where you can start to really pull the lever back and forth on what is top priority. It's based on how much confidence we have about, are we really right with our impact? Are we really right with our estimates? If we're not real confident, it gets a lower score, and that lowers the overall RICE score. And finally, that effort. And this is where we go from months to maybe sprints in our estimate. Again, we probably don't know enough yet to make a really great estimate on how long this project is going to take, but it's at least enough for us to start prioritizing and road mapping. And finally, if these tools don't work for you, you might just have to force rank everything. And that's a pretty hard yet simple conversation around, we're only going to deliver one thing this quarter. What's going to be the one thing that you need from us? So we've spent a lot of time learning. Now let's finally build. Now we can go fast. Welcome to Agile. The stories are made up and the points don't matter. Well, this is my favorite phrase when it comes to Agile, and that's just because you have stories and sticky notes and stand up every day, it doesn't mean you're Agile. So some Agile do's and don'ts, things that we found success with and things that we found aren't great. We want you to deliver an outcome in every sprint for your user. That could definitely be a demo. Even if it's not actual software that they're going to pick up and use, if you can demo the outcome that you've talked about to your user, that's a great deliverable. Do that. You do want to use spikes to answer specific questions. We've often had spikes that turned into never-ending rabbit holes because there was no question we were trying to answer. This isn't an open-ended research project. It's, hey, is this new database solution going to meet our throughput needs? Yes or no? And you do want to keep your epics or collection of stories to reasonable length. You don't want epics that go on and on and on for months and months. The other success that we've had at Sendgrid is keeping the number of epics we're working on very limited, our work in progress. We target 1 or 2 in total as a team. This allows us to focus and finish that work and give us enough space to start researching the next epic and respond to emergencies as they pop up. There are traps in Agile, and some of the traps that we have fallen into are stories that are just unclear. They're missing acceptance criteria. They just don't make any sense. I encourage you to push back. Use your definition of ready as well as your definition of done to say this isn't a story that the team can pick up and work with. We also try not to accept epics that are masquerading as stories. Things will drop into the queue without any research, and it looks fairly simple, but the conversation hasn't happened around that yet. To really understand what is the user trying to get out of this. Push back on those as you start to scratch at them and understand that there's a lot of moving pieces here. That's an epic that needs a lot of work. You need some legwork there, a story map, customer interviews. Go back to your learning phase on that before you start to build it. And finally, don't let a story drag on from sprint to sprint to sprint. That goes back to the second one. There's a smell there. That was probably an epic that's masquerading or didn't have clear acceptance criteria. You don't know when to finish that story. So push back on those. So building isn't just building. Building is launching. And so before you launch your product, I want you to dog food it. We've had a lot of great success here. At Sendgrid, we use and abuse some internal tools over and over when we start new projects or when we change the build systems or the test automation. So we're using dog food on our own stuff to ensure that the new tooling is working. We're going to write all of our docs and test them. And one great way that the teams that I work with have found success there is someone who didn't work on the project will pick up the docs and just start from scratch. Blank terminal and try to do the thing. And when they run into issues, they either augment the documentation or they drop a Jira ticket back onto that team's board to fix their documentation that tells them where it was broken, what they were expecting that didn't happen. You also want to test your onboarding and transition plan. This goes beyond just testing your docs. The way that we do this at Sendgrid is to go back to a team that we validated a problem with and ask them to use our docs. Have them actually try to onboard onto this platform. So launching a product. I encourage you to create an environment of handoffs, not drop-offs. Again, this goes back to, if you don't tell anybody about your software, how are they going to know how to use it? And there's a dirty word here, marketing. But marketing is actually fairly simple. Demos are marketing. Lunch and learns are marketing. Tech talks are marketing. All of those are marketing for your product or your service or your tool chain. And some of the best marketing that we've found at Sendgrid is to have another team demo for us. When another team demos the new tool that your team came up with, you get much better adoption. And the other thing to remember is that new teammate who's going to start in 6 months, who you haven't met yet. They're going to have to figure out where this tool is and how to use it. So don't forget about them. Product discovery is a key part of launching a product. So the last step in that learn, build, measure triangle is to measure. So what you want to do is capture some data around your success criteria. We didn't talk about this, I kind of skipped over it. You want to define success for your product before you start, because if you don't know if it was successful or if it's going to fail, you won't know what to do next. So define the outcomes that you're driving. If you know that you want to have 50% of build jobs on the new build pipeline in 6 months, and at 6 months you're at 0, it might be time to just scrap that or pivot. You can also conduct more customer interviews. Follow up with those teams. Ask them how their life has changed with this new tool put into place. And finally, the magic, repeat. We're going to learn again. Did we meet our objectives for this change? We're going to build again. If we use the story map, we can go to that next slice. And if we've met all of the outcomes that our customer needs, we can move to the next thing in our roadmap. And we're going to measure again. keep an eye on those metrics, especially metrics around adoption. But no one is good to, that you've met, excuse me, no one is good enough. And go and solve the next problem for your customer. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about sunsetting, because we all probably have a bunch of zombie tools out there that are causing tech debt and pain for ourselves. Sometimes a new platform or a service can just fail. And I encourage you, if it does, just kill it. Don't volunteer yourself for tech debt. If no one's using it, burn that sucker to the ground. We find that new platforms can solve problems and replace tech debt as well. Tech debt is often one of the big pain points for your customers because nobody's working to improve that system. Well, if we can sunset that system and solve a problem at the same time, that's win-win. Let's go do that instead of trying to keep putting Band-Aids and duct tape on the old broken stuff. And finally, you want to make sure that you have a transition plan. Just launching a new product and telling people it'll fix all their problems isn't going to guarantee that they move over. They might be married to that old chain. So quick recap. These are just tools. We're going to learn by validating problems with our customers. Get out there and talk to them. We're going to build new tools using story maps that you validate with those customers. As part of your building, you want to dog food new things with your own tooling and launch with a partner. That's where you're going to find success. Finally, you're going to measure usage of your product and your success objectives and make a call on expanding or pivoting, but make sure you know when to stop building. And you're going to repeat and get better and better and better at this cycle. So thank you so much for inviting me. Again, you can throw the virtual tomatoes at me on Twitter at Heimbuck, or email me at Gmail. Happy to send the deck out or answer any questions. Thanks so much. Yeah.
Okay. We got any questions? Yeah, there's one back here.
Oh, that was fast.
In your experience, are there differences between building primarily for developers versus people external to your organization?
Building for external developers or your delivery team, sorry?
I mean, just like delivering to like a consumer of the end user of the product.
From a product perspective, no. I mean, ultimately, you might have a more technical product, but at the end of the day, they have problems that they're trying to solve, or they have workarounds around things that you've already built for them. And that's, you want to focus on those things and then solve that pain point.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Who else? Got any other questions? Where at? Oh.
How do you measure which tools aren't being used? Do you gather metrics, or is that based off of the interviews that you have?
When I started, it was mostly through the interviews. We've since tried to build in telemetry into all of our systems so that we have a good sense of what usage is. And that's now one of the base requirements going into a new system or new tool.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Like to transition off tools or introduce new ones?
So we found a lot of success with partnering with a team who we validated the problem with and had that kind of crawl step as far as the onboarding goes. And at that point, when they can show success with the tool, it spreads a lot quicker versus us dropping off a tool and saying, this is what you should go use. So when you have that pure success, you're going to see other teams adopt that much quicker. We also have a mole on the product side, me, being able to talk to other product managers about why they should incorporate these things. And especially when you can bring data about, while it took one sprint for a team to onboard to this new tool set, their builds are now 35% faster, or whatever success metric you're looking for in a system. Yep.
Any other questions? Over here? No? Okay. I guess we're good. All right. One more time, please put your hands together
Thank
for
you.
James.